Welcome back to the Download Show, where we dive deep with the world's most innovative minds shaping our future. Today we're talking about education, not as it is, but what it could be. My guest is Pegor Papazian, a visionary at the intersection of technology, creativity, and learning. He's Chief Development Officer of TUMO Center for Creative Technologies, a groundbreaking after-school program that's reimagining how teenagers learn. No grades, no tests, no teachers, just pure curiosity and agency-driven exploration in everything from coding to filmmaking. Under his leadership, TUMO has grown from a single experiment to Armenia to a global model with centers in Paris, Berlin, and beyond. Welcome to the show, Pegor.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. Now, I want to first dig into basically how you think about TUMO and its pedagogy. How did you guys come and arrive to that?
Yeah, so at TUMO we like to say kids may hate to study, but they love to learn. And the key there is about agency, putting learners in charge of their own learning trajectory. But that's not just about personalization and adapting curricula to kids. It's really about understanding that motivation is really the golden currency of learning. If you tell me you have a choice between a learner who's like 20% more like stronger in terms of literacy, right? More numeracy, reading, etc., versus another kid who is 20% more motivated. I would take the motivated kid any time because they're going to work through the issues. And we're talking about sustained intrinsic motivation, right? And so when you're playing a video game, for example, they're putting in a lot of hard work. You can see it on their face. They're really serious. They're doing even rote work. Just they want to get to that next level, and they'll do whatever it takes. They figure things out. They solve problems. If you can bring that to the learning space, it changes the whole game. And we've seen that at TUMO time and time again, where when we do say, okay, gravitate away from what's not very interesting to you towards what's more interesting, it doesn't really matter what topic you're focusing on, as long as what you're focusing on really gets you excited and gives that golden currency, motivation, right? And then if we dig into the next level of that, what are some of the impediments to motivation? So one is the lack of choice, right? If you prescribe what they're going to study, there's a 10% chance that you might hit what they're actually interested in, right?
Right.
But then there's the learning efficiency issues. We expect kids to sit in a classroom for weeks to learn a concept that could otherwise be learned in hours, in some cases. And we think it's perfectly okay to have impose that time stress on them. It's almost a learner's rights issue, right? We call it consensual learning. The kid has to be there because they want to be there. And I always tell the story of my son when one of my kids was really young, learning the Armenian alphabet, and at school. And we were really worried because he wasn't picking it up. We're like, oh, is there an issue? At home, though, he would pick up a Pokemon card. He didn't know how to read, but he would literally read the Pokemon cards, all of them. Like, obviously, there was some different environment, some different motivational dynamic that made it so much more efficient to learn the Pokemon cards. And that's really at the center of TUMO's pedagogy.
Now, in terms of, and this is one of our discussions at the WCIT conference in Yerevan, of AI and learning in the age of AI. Is AI a critical part of actually now TUMO's pedagogy?
Oh, yeah. And there's two ways to look at that. One is that our pedagogy was always kind of a good fit with an AI future. It was always AI proof, even before the fact. Because whenever we teach Python or graphic design with Photoshop or whatever it may be, we always say, we don't really care about Python. We don't really care about the specific tools you're learning because that's going to be obsolete by the time you need it. It's more the core skills, what sometimes are called soft skills that you were able to acquire, like time management, initiative, the ability to learn autonomously, to pick up the next thing, right? And with AI, that's even more the case now. We've been completely vindicated. AI is going to replace some of these things that humans do much faster than anybody had anticipated. So it really becomes important to hone in on the core competencies, right? The curiosity, the motivation. So that's one aspect in which AI and TUMO intersect. The other is, yes, we're obviously deploying AI in all our skill areas, whether that's filmmaking or coding or whatever the case may be. We're also introducing a whole AI vertical, which is based on agents, agentic AI. So for example, in one of our new workshops that we've designed, kids, the learners play this game of what's sometimes called broken telephone, where you whisper something to your friend and they whisper that same word to the other, and by the 10th whisper, it's a completely different word. So each student is building a AI agent that talks to, use an API to feed some text, images, and audio to, let's say, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, then get back a modified version of that based on some criteria like, I'm a science fiction nerd, I'm a, I don't know, Spider-Man fan or whatever, so I'm modifying the text. And so it starts with one of the students coming up with the backstory, a jingle, and the image for a superhero, feeding those to the next learner's bot, which then transforms it, feeds it to the next, and by the time you're done, you have a completely different thing. They laugh, they have fun, it's interesting, but they made some API calls, and it changes their life, right? And the next conversation about AI, they know it's less interesting to talk about, is it conscious? And it's more interesting about how can I use this to make my agent, right? And so those are kind of the things that we've already introducing, and it's really exciting stuff.
Fantastic.
And maybe to add a third component, which is how we're using AI in our educational process. We're not big on AI tutors, simply because others are building such good ones. We'll just incorporate whatever others are building. We're building AI coach, so that this is the coach that can be a companion with the kid when they're making choices about what to do next. So the coach will say things like, oh, there's this learning lab coming up in 2 months. I know you're really into game development. You're not going to make it because you don't have the prerequisites. Why don't you ditch this animation thing you're doing, do some coding so you can get the things like that, which, again, feed directly into the motivation aspect of the pedagogy.
Now, it's interesting that I want to talk about the human element out of this. So it sounds like you are doing a lot of AI stuff. But I also recall when we were talking in Yerevan, you were saying, especially during COVID, you actually insisted that, I believe, students actually go to the center because the human element is still very quite critical, whether it's the tutors, whether it's the social element. Can you talk about still that human element within kind of the AI element that you have across the three kind of spheres? Where does the humanness come into all those?
So during COVID, we did do a distributed from home version of TUMO. It worked quite well, except we started losing the more marginalized kids, the ones that were from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. They were less well equipped to participate in that mode, maybe because of technology, maybe because of other factors. So after COVID, we brought everybody back. We abandoned the online model. Yes, it's not, of course, the human aspect, but the social aspect is really what matters. Being with other kids, not having that feeling of isolation and loneliness. I personally believe that as the technology develops more and AI advances, we'll be able to achieve some of that social dynamic, even in a hybrid or not in-person environment. Right now, over Zoom calls and the current chatbots, it's not there yet. But it's not like we're religiously opposed to not being in person. What we want is the social aspect to help us out. And again, back to motivation. Why does social matter? Because that's the context in which you want to seem very cool to your teammate or classmate or whatever, and that becomes a motivational factor. So we care about the social and the human aspect to the extent that it turbocharges motivation, and not because we think that human teachers are better than machine teachers. They are, but that could change, right? I don't know. The motivation factor still applies. The social factor still applies.
Interesting. Now, let's take one level up. So we've kind of talked about, very specific TUMO centers. You've got the human aspect and the AI aspect. If you were to design education, mainstream education as a whole, how do you take those two elements and then how do you scale to mainstream education?
Right. Look, the biggest disadvantage that mainstream education has compared to an informal thing like TUMO is this prescribed standards and curricula, right? So you can't have a school in many countries where by grade X you haven't kind of mastered solving two equations with two unknowns or whatever the case may be, right? And so everybody's kind of teaching to that curriculum, being assessed and evaluated based on how well they achieved those standards. And so there's very little room to maneuver. So I don't want to be this guy who comes in and says, oh, you guys should reform public education. It's so fundamentally ingrained into the system that it's a little hard to do. Outside of the system, it's all about, project-based learning, agency, collaboration, all the things we talk about that very few entities do. We try to do them. For example, we have this set of no's, just to illustrate. No diplomas, no tests, no entrance requirements, no class cohorts. We mix them all together. All of those fly right in the face of standard public education, but are crucial to the way we do things, right? And so and it turns out you don't need grades and diplomas and tests in order to achieve amazing learning outcomes. We're seeing it time and time again. In 2023, there was a longitudinal study done on the past 12 years of TUMO's operation in Armenia and 6 years in Paris, which is our oldest international center. The results are very impressive. I mean, kids are performing better in school, better in university, getting better jobs, making more money if they've been to TUMO, without any competition between kids. So it's a myth that you need that. What you do need is motivation. So if you're not achieving intrinsic, sustained motivation in some other way, you can do it by having tests and punishing them if they fail. That's the next best thing, I guess, but it's not nearly as good.
So you're basically saying the TUMO model as it exists right now can only exist as a out-of-school program.
Until some legislation changes and some... Look, when we started TUMO in Armenia many years ago, it was a bit of a reaction against the Soviet-era education style that Armenia had inherited, right? And then, as we started expanding globally, we realized, wait a minute, all school systems are a little bit Soviet at their core, right? And so and that would have to change at some level in order for something like TUMO or the TUMO pedagogy to start working in a school environment without, breaking laws and, defying standards and so on.
So it's almost as if it would have to be recreated from the ground up, actually.
Yeah, unless there's some way of kind of creating a parallel stream. That's an idea we had once, to create these lighthouse schools that are experimental and that end up proving themselves as being kind of very effective. I would love to have a TUMO-style math curriculum. Right? We don't teach math per se. Interestingly, TUMO kids perform better in math in school than the non-TUMO counterparts. Even when we compare somebody who has been at TUMO for 1 year and somebody who just entered TUMO, the 1-year kid performs better in math at school, even though we don't teach it. Why? Because of motivation. Again, I'm the same word. I would love to have a curriculum which, in parallel with graphic design, motion graphics, coding, robotics, has linear algebra, right? Number theory, etc., in the same project-based self-learning combined with workshops model that we use at TUMO, I think it would be super effective. We don't do it now because we don't want to directly replicate what schools are doing, so we complement what they're doing. But I think it would work perfectly well and would love to experiment one day.
Tell me a little bit about this upcoming AI Teens conference, TUMO AI Teens conference that you have coming up. Is it the fact that you're fully more integrating AI? Is it the fact that you're moving kind of a worldwide global, it seems like a global kind of conference from all over of all TUMO participants? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So we now have TUMO centers and upcoming TUMO centers in many parts of the world. 16 of those locations are participating in this conference, starting from Takasaki, Japan, through, Bangalore, Mumbai, Kampala, Yerevan, all the way to the European centers, Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, ending up in South America, the East Coast, in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and finally in Los Angeles. And so it goes from east to west, following daylight. It's an in-person conference in 16 different locations connected to each other with a live stream, right? So it's sort of in-person live hybrid or in-person streaming hybrid. But the idea is to give teenagers a real voice for once, right? When we talk about AI for teens, we're very quick to point out or assume what they're interested in, what they should be worried about. Here's the dangers that it poses. And when we're talking to teens, they have very different, sometimes counterintuitive ideas. Sometimes they're more conservative than the adults. Sometimes it's the opposite. You'd be surprised. Like, for example, they're deciding what kind of guests should be speakers. And we were like, they should all be teenagers. Like, no, we want some adults in the room. We want to hear from experts. Okay. So even when there are adults in the conference, it's because teens think they want to see adults. So they're, for example, in one session, they're interviewing Sal Khan, the founder of CEO of Khan Academy.
Yes.
So we have a bunch of teenagers in four different cities around the world doing a fireside chat with Sal. That was something they wanted. We'd be able to get that for them. And the hope is that at the end of it, we'll have a much more authoritative idea about what teenagers want or are interested in, what are their hopes and fears about AI versus our assumptions, right, as adults.
And then from those insights, what do you hope to achieve from those insights?
So we want to publish it online as a kind of website with video snippets, summaries, etc., and then have some takeaways and saying you're developing AI kind of policies and tools for teenagers to use or to help teenagers, maybe you should take a look at what they think about all this, right?
Interesting. And I assume a lot of policymakers, they haven't even grasped actually how AI kind of touches adults, much less teens.
That's right. So in a way, you could say, since teens and adults know pretty much the same thing about AI, like not much,
right,
might as well bring them into the conversation.
That's a great approach. Well, thank you much for your time.
Oh, thank you. This was fun.